has just said that the U.S.'s bombs probably caused very significant damage to Fordow, the uranium enrichment plant. And the quote here, given the payload utilized and the extremely vibration sensitive of those centrifuges down there, is expected to have. One can tell yet the extent at that site. They're in country, but not at that site. Also on Sunday at the UN Security Council, he appeared to warn that the U.S.'s strikes on Iran could also bring an end to nuclear non-proliferation. He alluded to the possibility that Iran might, in fact, speed toward a bomb now. He also raised the question of what's actually happened to about 900 pounds of uranium has been enriched to 60%. A reminder, 90% is weapons grade, but is far higher than the 3.5% that they should actually be having. Separately, Iran's foreign minister, Sayed Abbas Araghchi, is now in Moscow. He flew over yesterday to meet President Vladimir Putin and said that Iran will now coordinate with Russia on some kind of response. And after he landed, he said that these two countries have common enemies and that the two are also, quote unquote, friends.
And Remy, is there any clue as to how exactly Iran might retaliate?
Many, actually. Iran's government does have options for targets, Errol. These are military, and there is also economic targets, specifically energy, for example, in the Mideast. The U.S. has what some experts consider are 8 permanent bases in as many countries. Lighting up your screen there. In orange, Qatar has the biggest U.S. base, Al Udeid Air Base. About 10,000 troops are believed to be there. Bahrain, just next door to the west, has a U.S. naval base, about 9,000 troops. Also, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq. About Iraq, a Mideast expert at British security think tank RUSI told me that U.S. assets there could be the next potential front line, and pointed to Iran-linked paramilitary groups also operating in the country.
All right, Remy Inocencio in London with the latest on that. Remy, thanks.
Of course.
Now, following U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear sites over the weekend, Israel and Iran are continuing to trade attacks this morning. We have some dramatic dashcam footage to show you that captures an explosion next to a road. This is in Ashdod, Israel, as Iran fired multiple missiles. Meanwhile, Israel's defense ministry says it's striking Iranian government targets in Tehran. For more on what is an escalating situation in the Middle East, we're connecting once again with Eric Loeb. He's an associate professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. Eric, welcome back. Good morning to you. What reaction are we seeing inside Iran from these U.S. strikes? We know that Israel had taken out some of its military leadership, and there had been some discontent among the people toward its own leaders. So what is
and thanks again for having me. While there are many people who are via this regime, the more that there's military pressure on the country from Israel and now the United States, the more that people are separating their antipathy towards the regime with feelings of nationalism, both inside and outside the country, and really feeling sadness, shock, and fear and uncertainty in terms of what's next. And some Iranians are just prioritizing their own survival and the survival of their friends and family with such an uncertain future. So it's quite a complicated scenario in Iran. It's just a simple scenario where people are going to rise up against the regime at this point in time.
And it may be difficult for Iranians to separate what was an Israeli strike, what was a U.S. strike. What considerations might the government make when assessing potential retaliation? Because there have been scores of deaths.
Well, that's absolutely right. And this has also led to increased nationalism and concern in Iran from not just the government, but the population, with hundreds of people that have been killed and thousands wounded. We don't know the exact numbers. The Iranian government is weighing their response and their retaliation, and the foreign minister has said that they will not negotiate with the U.S. until they've retaliated. Yesterday, the Iranian parliament approved plans to close the Strait of Hormuz and impose an economic cost on the United States. But that decision needs to be approved by the Iranian National Security Council, by the supreme leader himself. So we will see what happens, and we will see if Iran, to what extent they would strike U.S. military assets in the region. If they would do so on a large scale, that would further escalate the situation, or if they may do so in a limited, measured way that may provide a diplomatic off-ramp for both sides to avoid an all-out war.
Yeah, and all U.S. forces in the region on a state of heightened alert. Globe, great to connect with you. Thanks for joining us. And as Eric mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz may close. And in fact, oil futures are spiking in reaction to the turmoil in the Middle East. And investors do fear that Iran would disrupt what is global shipping via the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that channel is the only way to ship crude oil from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. 20% of the world's oil passes through the strait. Any disturbance will have a significant impact on the global economy. Only Iran's National Security Council has the authority to close the strait. CBS News contributor Javier David joins us now to talk more about this. He's the business editor for the Dallas Morning News. Javier, good morning to you. What would happen if this decision is made in Iran to close the strait? What would happen next?
Yeah, look, we have a sort of a war on two fronts now. We've got one that's policy-based. It's all about the tariffs and the trade war. And now we have this armed conflict that is spurring the price of oil. So just to throw some numbers at you, Brent crude at the start of the month was trading around $62 a barrel. We've now built in a quote unquote war premium of about 30% to nearly $80. So commodity investors are kind of having the best time that they've had since the start of the year. These are real economic risks associated with this. So, you'll see more than likely a lot of analysts are building in the possibility of a run at $80 a barrel, $90 a barrel, perhaps even above $100 a barrel. And under the most extreme scenarios, that adds about $1 per gallon to gas and diesel prices. So these are real and sustained risks.
And we see gas prices usually increase in some cases over the summer, in many cases anyway, just because of the increased demand. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it would be economic suicide, though, for Iranians to shut down the strait. That would be an expected reaction. How likely is it to happen, do you think?
Well, look, this is a very high likelihood. Iran was blindsided and really humiliated by these strikes. They're vowing to the West, in particular the U.S., pay the price. The easiest way to do that is, of course, through the price of oil and energy prices. But luckily for us, it isn't the 1970s anymore. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer. We still import oil internationally. It's not nearly as damaging as it could have been if we were still wholly dependent on foreign crude. So we're far more energy independent and secure these days. It doesn't totally insulate us from shocks, but it does help us blunt the sharper edges of what could happen.
Yeah, other nations have diversified as well. I mean, India, for example, has moved away from Middle Eastern sources of oil while adding others to the mix. We know that global markets are open this morning. Do you see any trends right now that might be a signal for the U.S. of what kind of week this will be?
Yeah, ongoing concerns. We talk a lot about oil now, but don't forget about the tariffs, and that has all been a very real concern about global growth. So you have these two things. Tariffs are bad for global demand. They're bad for growth. But in the very short term, we're going to see a lot of volatility in the price of crude and in other energy prices that filter in. It's just not a good for the outlook in terms of our ability to manage all of these crises at once.
All right, Javier David with the latest economic headlines on this major story. Thanks so much. And we will continue to track fallout from the U.S. strikes on Iran. Later this hour, the Pentagon reveals exactly how the U.S. carried out what it's calling the largest B-2 operational strike in U.S. history. Also coming up.
I'm grateful to be standing freely next to you all.
Khalil, the pro-Palestinian activist detained by ICE for months, speaks out 2 days after his release. His message to the Trump administration. And after the break, prosecutors could rest their case today in the Sean Diddy Combs sex trafficking and racketeering trial. We'll tell you what's next. Get you this headline now. 3 people, including 6-year-old twin sisters, were killed Sunday.
I realize that my job number one
it's best to portray me as someone who's violent. Mahmoud Khalil is a human rights defender. Mahmoud Khalil is a freedom fighter. Mahmoud Khalil is a refugee. Mahmoud Khalil is a father and husband. And above all, Mahmoud Khalil is Palestinian.
Michael George, CBS News, New York.
And we want to share this with you. CBS News reached out to DHS about Mahmoud Khalil's case and received this statement saying in part, quote, "This is yet another example of how out of control members of the judicial branch are undermining national security. Quote, their conduct not only denies the result of the 2024 election, it also does great harm by undermining public confidence in the courts." All right, I'll see you in 1 hour from now, and I'll be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern for another edition of the CBS Morning News. But stay right where you are. CBS Mornings Plus is next with Adriana and Vlad. They'll have updates on today's big stories, and they'll speak
number of bombs used by the U.S. on the nuclear sites. How do they read that over there? What's your sense of what that might mean?
Well, certainly the Qataris aren't counting that number. You know, Margaret had reported 6. We're hearing as many as 10, but nowhere near the amount of munitions that were dropped on those nuclear sites in Iran. And it's part of Iran's messaging here. And again, we discussed it before. This is symbolic. Going after Al Udeid, the biggest, the headquarters of CENTCOM in the Middle East, it's symbolic, saying we're going to get you where you are. Also, one of the best defended, knowing full well that if any base was going to be able to defend against a missile attack, a short-range missile attack like that, it would be capable of doing that. And as we've discussed before, all of these bases throughout the Middle East have already been, on high alert and reinforced with beefed up surveillance. This is ahead of the attacks in Iran. Bahrain has closed down its airspace. Well, that is another huge base. That's the Fifth Fleet. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is based there. Kuwait has also rang the alarm in its areas. Again, these are all areas where there are U.S. bases. So not necessarily saying that they are next or that there's anything to indicate that they might be coming under attack, but they're looking at what's happening at the audacity of attack at a place like Al Udeid and saying, well, we've got U.S. troops here. We've got U.S. troops in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet. And then again, we really have to keep an eye on the more vulnerable troops, as Holly mentioned earlier, the ones who had already come under attack previously, places like Al-Assad, which is much more vulnerable to attack because they simply do not have the kind of air defenses that you might see at a place like Al Udeid and in Bahrain with the Fifth Fleet. Right. So I think we have to look at the nature of this attack, whether this is the beginning. The Qataris are saying that all of the missiles were intercepted without anybody getting injured. We're still waiting to hear from CENTCOM to see their reaction to it. But remember, CENTCOM is not just worried about Al Udeid. They're worried about every single base in that region. So they're going to have their hands full. And I understand why they're probably a little bit busy at the moment.
Charlie D'Agata, what we were seeing there before the map was the activation of the air defenses in Qatar. Let's go back to Margaret Brennan, who has some new reporting for us on the phone. Margaret?
Hi, John. We know that the other allies who have significant U.S. military presence on their shores, Kuwait, for example, which has the 4th largest U.S. military installation in the world, is bracing. There was an expectation that that firing at Qatar would happen, and that along with it there could be follow-on attacks. And so that is why some of the countries did start to look at closing their airspace earlier today. We know that there are further conversations being had as well amongst other U.S. intel agencies, Homeland Security officials, as well as the State Department and DoD CENTCOM about planning for this. So we do know that the Omanis, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, all of those countries that have been allies to both are bracing. What is interesting in terms of the firing at the U.S. base rather than at the city of Doha, for example, in Qatar, is that it's hitting at the United States directly. So far, these intercepted missiles did not appear to be aimed at domestic targets within Qatar. That would truly change the dynamic in the region. Qatar trades with Iran. Iran is not incredibly isolated in this region. It actually has started to rebuild some of its ties with some of these Arab states that they had tension with over years past. And so this is reintroducing some tension, though. But there's tension on the American side as well, with these allies saying, we didn't have a warning well in advance that the United States was going to go ahead with this attack. The U.S. did notify 20 or 30 countries, a small number of them, though, when the planes were in the air. Those who are in most direct risk. Saudi Arabia, for example, did have advance notice. Bahrain, some of the other regional allies did not.
And Margaret, very quickly, if the White House was expecting this, if this was the expected response, does that, going back to the idea of calibration, does that mean then that the next thing we should, how should that inform how we understand the next things we might hear from the Secretary of State or maybe even from the president himself, if this is something that was prepared for and if they receive it as a calibrated attack rather than a full-throated, all-out response?
Well, John, we know that in the planning for the attacks the U.S. carried out on Fordow, on Isfahan, and Natanz, it was not just the strikes that CENTCOM was planning for, it was also the blowback and the theater. So there were protective measures put in place. So this had to have been gamed out with President Trump, right? He had to have been thinking about this as well. But that question is whether he goes up the escalation ladder or lets this go. And that is the difference between this being what was described yesterday in public by the Secretary of Defense as targeted and limited and specific to the nuclear program, or whether this becomes a more, a broader conflict. We know the President and the Secretary of State have indicated the U.S. has already identified other targets inside Iran it could hit. Didn't define that. Are those further nuclear sites, or are they now going to go up their escalation ladder? Right. So we know we've been looking at two options. It's going to be what he chooses.
Margaret Brennan, thank you very much. I want to go back to Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has some new information. Nancy?
John, here's what we've heard from White House officials so far as they continue to watch what is unfolding in Qatar. We're told by a White House official that White House is aware of and closely monitoring threats to Al Udeid Air Base in that top national security officials, Pentagon officials were already gathered at the White House for a scheduled meeting with the president. While there, they can take advantage of the Situation Room to monitor events as they unfold in Qatar. We have received more expansive reaction from the nation of Qatar itself, however. A short time ago, a spokesperson for the Qatari Foreign Ministry strongly condemning this attack by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, saying, quote, "We consider this a flagrant violation of the sovereignty of the state of Qatar." All of this putting the Gulf states and U.S. allies in the region in a very difficult position, John. On one hand, they don't want to get dragged into a wider conflict. On the other hand, they have had grave concerns about Iranian aggression and Iran's attempts to build a nuclear weapon for years, if not decades. And they shared those concerns with President Trump when he was in the region last month in Qatar, in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. As one top official in one of those Gulf states described it to me, they worry greatly about the possibility of a nuclear accident in Iran causing grave harm to their citizens. They said, look, if there was a nuclear accident in New York, you are going to feel the effects in New Jersey. And that's how they feel about it there. So a very difficult set of circumstances for.
बोल के थक गया।
क्या हुआ?
नया किडबैक चाहिए।
तो कैप्टन से बोलो। नहीं सुना तो मैनेजर से।
करेक्ट।
तो ऐसे ही पहले शिकायत बैंक से करें, 30 दिनों में जवाब या समाधान ना मिलने पर सीएमएस पोर्टल पे शिकायत करें। तो पहले बैंक, फिर सीएमएस पोर्टल, नहीं तो शिकायत होगी नामंजूर। चले? ले आ गया naked bag.
आरबीआई कहता है
पहले अपना बैंक, फिर आरबीआई ओम्बुड्समैन।
Embrace the power of knowledge at Sanskriti University with tradition and culture of holy city Mathura to achieve excellence in your life. Sanskriti University offers courses in more than 70 disciplines for diploma, undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD. Start your enthralling career with Sanskriti University and be the leader in India's growth story. Visit www.sanskriti.edu.in.
All the force protection assets that we need if there were a different type of response from Iran. And I think we'll watch that situation develop.
What questions are going through your mind as someone who's been in the jobs you have been, in terms of what would you want to know right now if you had access to the intelligence, or what do you think is the most important thing to think about over the next, say, 24 hours?
Well, there's a lot of questions. This could go a lot of ways, John. I think first and foremost, let's stick with the force protection problem, right? Is understanding that capacity that the Iranians have, understanding what they might be moving or positioning to take advantage of vulnerabilities that we have. I think we want to understand how well they can see and understand the battle space. And certainly our forces are taking actions, whether that's moving so that they're not always sitting stationary at an expected location and can be targeted, right? We're going to take those appropriate actions to ensure American men and women and our allies are safe.
And linger on that last point again. What kinds of things, I mean, at the base right now, what do you expect is happening in terms of personnel?
Certainly they're strengthening their defenses. They're alerting people to be ready for an attack. They've got their equipment and personal protective gear with them. They understand where they're going to be able to shelter and those types of things. Air defense units on the installations are at a higher level of readiness and alert to respond if there is another missile attack of any type. And I think those significant assets, very vulnerable assets that we might have, we're looking to make sure, can we move them somewhere else, either out of harm's way or keep them moving so that they can't be targeted in a more static way.
One other thing I want to ask you about is something you mentioned is it the case, or do you imagine it's the case, that U.S. intelligence is trying to figure out not just what Iran will do, but what it can do now that it's been significantly damaged by the Israeli attacks and now by the U.S. action?
Absolutely. And I think your second question is the more important one, right? We want to understand that capacity. We want to understand what is the range of options that they have. It's not about necessarily picking, this is exactly what we think they can do. It's about understanding what's that range of possibilities and preparing for that range.
Right. All right. Let's go back now to Holly Williams, who is in Erbil, Iraq. Holly, just staying on that question of what Iran actually can do. Iran has been significantly weakened over the last 2 weeks as a result of these attacks.
That's right, John. You know, Margaret was just talking then about the US expecting and planning for blowback. I think a lot of people here in the Middle East over the last day and a half have been sort of gaming out, asking themselves, what exactly is a weakened Iran capable of? What kind of retaliation can it carry out? Because make no mistake, Iran has been significantly weakened by more than 10 days of war with Israel. We have seen video after video coming from the Israeli military of strikes on missile launch sites, on Iranian drones. Now, it's really difficult to quantify, but I think we can assume that Iran's military is significantly less capable than it was 10 days ago. Not only that, also think about Iran's proxies here in the Middle East, the so-called axis of resistance. They have also been significantly weakened over the last 18 months or so. Hamas has been pummeled in Gaza. Hezbollah's leadership has been decimated by Israel in Lebanon. Here in Iraq, the Iran-backed militia groups responsible for the deaths of hundreds of US troops over the years have also been significantly weakened. And then the Houthis in Yemen have also been targeted with airstrikes. So we've been asking ourselves, what is a weakened Iran capable of? I guess today we have a little bit more clarity on that.
Important point, Holly, that it's not just the missiles they can fire, but also what they can activate or not activate in those proxy forces that they have throughout the Middle East. Holly Williams, thank you. Let's bring in senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata from the Pentagon. Charlie, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, again, first of all, just an update. We believe that whatever missile attack was pointed towards the Qataris and the Al Udeid is over. We're trying to get a count on how many, between 6 and 10. There are varying reports that there was an attack on the Al-Assad base in Iraq. The Iraqis themselves are denying that report that it happened. And I want to point out, so there are air raid sirens going on all across that Central Command region, places like Kuwait and places like Bahrain. Again, like Al Udeid, huge bases, well reinforced. In the case of Bahrain, you've got the Navy's 5th Fleet that's based there. It will be very heavily defended. But we have to talk about the more vulnerable areas, which is why everybody's paying attention to the Al-Assad base, which Holly pointed out earlier. Back in 2020, it came under a sustained attack. TBIs, a lot of traumatic brain injuries, but it was a serious attack, and one that Iran has and its proxies have attacked again and again because of its vulnerability. There are about 2,500 forces there. Closer to where Holly is another base there at Erbil in northern Iraq. Again, more vulnerable because it's smaller. It just doesn't have the kind of, Patriot defense systems and the kind of systems that you'd see, aside from the fact that the Qataris themselves will have their own air defense systems in place. So when you're talking about the vulnerability of U.S. forces, the smaller the base, the forward operating base, the more vulnerable they are to attack because they don't have the kind of weaponry and machinery to take those incoming missiles down. We also want to point out there are about 700 to 900 special forces in Syria. And when we talk about the vulnerability of these forces because of their small footprint, they're also surrounded by bad neighbors. So they are within reach of Iran itself and Iranian missiles, but also within reach of any number, and I say that, any number of anti-American, possibly pro-Iranian regimes, either backed by Iran or just anti-American. And they are rife throughout parts of Iraq, especially around al-Assad, and also in Syria itself. So the big concern, certainly from CENTCOM, is if we see a sophisticated, coordinated attack on multiple bases, say you go after Al Udeid, you go after Bahrain, you go after Kuwait, and then you go after these smaller bases like al-Assad, because the United States has beefed up its posture there. There's plenty of military options in the CENTCOM region. But if you overwhelm these bases all at once, and that's why all these alarms all over the Middle East, that causes concern.
Right. That would be the full ladder of escalation. At the moment, it appears that we're on the lower rungs of that ladder, at least based on this preliminary reporting. A U.S. official confirms that the short and medium range missiles that targeted Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar have produced no casualties that have been reported at this time. Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon, thank you. I want to bring back in CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, your thoughts?
My thoughts are that right now the intelligence community is working only to try to assess two things. One is, of course, the state of Iran's nuclear program. But second is the intentions of the supreme leader of Iran. We're all, of course, very focused on whether the U.S. government and the Israeli government know where he is. But separate and apart from his location, what's going through his mind right now is likely what the intelligence community is focused on. They are trying to assess whether the supreme leader is intent on getting into a prolonged conflict with not just Israel, but with the United States, or if, having suffered maximum pressure from the United States, from Israel, and from international sanctions, these latest military strikes over the past couple of weeks will in fact push him back to the negotiating table. I know, John, that there's a war of words right now, a lot of inflammatory rhetoric being thrown around, but having worked on the early days of the Obama-era nuclear deal, it is possible that there are private channels that are open between the U.S. government and Iran and the supreme leader to try to find an off-ramp and to bring folks to the negotiating table. So again, the intelligence community's assessment of the supreme leader's intentions here, not just the nuclear program, not just his location, but the supreme leader's intentions should be a critical part of any national security decision-making process that exists in this White House and that tees up a decision for the President of the United States.
Sam, I think that that makes good sense. And you know, one of the things that we're trying to assess, because it will set the conditions for the U.S. response, is this idea of calibration. At the moment, there is no reporting that there are any strikes outside of the Al Udeid base in Qatar. and that would, again, seem to be a calibrated, predictable response. The air defense systems appear to be working, and there have been no reports of casualties. So if this is a response that had to be taken, but that was very limited so as not to lead to more escalation, it would seem that it would be hard to imagine designing it for anything other than to maybe de-escalate and return to the negotiating table. What do you think about my what is admittedly speculation there?
Well, I will focus instead on the fact that we really just don't know at this point whether this was an isolated incident. If it is, then this was certainly a calibrated response, and I agree with your analysis. We just don't know. It is too soon to tell. We are receiving some reports that White House officials do believe that additional attacks on U.S. bases are coming. What we don't know is if they'll attack well-defended bases or if they'll concurrently activate proxies and launch cyber attacks. What we do know is where they have activated folks in the past, again, military installations, government officials, Jewish religious sites, Israeli diplomatic facilities, and more. So while we try to speculate on whether this is calibrated, the key factors here are whether this was an isolated incident, and if it was not, whether adequate security precautions have been taken at potential target sites to prepare for security incidents. I do know that here in the homeland, there's been extensive planning, and as Margaret so aptly noted, prior to President Trump authorizing the military strikes over the weekend, there was significant planning about scenarios that could unfold if Iran chose to retaliate overseas. I think the biggest vulnerability here is for American citizens traveling overseas in locations where we just don't have a lot of assets, where proxies could be activated. That's one risk that will continue to follow, John.
Okay, Sam Vinograd, thank you very much. Let's go back to senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata from the Pentagon. Just to reset for our viewers who are joining us, we have been reporting on Iranian missile attacks on their base or the U.S. base, I should say, in Qatar, the Al Udeid base in Qatar. At the moment, that is the only place we have reports of action. No casualties reported, and apparently the missile defense systems have intercepted whatever missiles were sent there. Charlie, let's go to you. Your thoughts.
Well, first of all, we have a U.S. official confirms, this is in the CENTCOM region, confirms that Iranian short and medium range missiles targeted the Al Udeid air base. No casualties reported at this time. This is obviously after the Qataris themselves had said that they had come under attack. That happened about 50 minutes ago when we first heard word about it. Just to give you, again, a broad picture there. Al Udeid is the largest base. It's where Central Command is based. It's the headquarters there. There are 9,000 U.S. forces. In addition to that base, the biggest base in the Middle East for U.S. forces, Bahrain is the home of the Fifth Fleet. That has had sirens going off and shelter-in-place warnings for the residents there, although there haven't been any incoming. Kuwait is also on high alert, another big base there. There were reports that the Al-Assad base in Iraq had come under attack, but both the Iraqis and others have said those reports are erroneous. But everybody is on high alert throughout that whole Central Command area because of what they're seeing here, not necessarily because there is a threat that's headed in their direction.
Sure, only prudent. Charlie D'Agata at the Pentagon, thank you. Joining us by phone is Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan. Margaret, the latest you've been hearing, and also just as you've been evaluating this strike and what your reporting tells you about how we should think about the diplomatic conditions here and how they've changed, is there an opportunity here for the diplomacy to rush in? And if so, what is that opportunity?
Well, John, I've been trying to get hold of U.S. officials to better understand, the thinking in the White House right now. The message has been ready for diplomacy at any time. I was told by Secretary Rubio just yesterday that Steve Witkoff, the president's personal envoy, is on a 12-hour standby to get on a plane to meet with Iranian officials at any time should they say it's a go. We don't have any sign that it is a go at this moment in time. But what we are seeing play out is very much within the realm of anticipated risk, anticipated threat. And in fact, when this kind of intelligence is picked up, either through satellite, through signals intelligence, whatever the source of it is, the U.S. government prepares internally. Legally, they're also required to notify the public that there is risk. The first notice we got of this, we saw via the State Department telling people in Qatar to shelter in place if you're American. A few hours earlier, they issued a warning worldwide to Americans everywhere that there is an increased level of risk to Americans. That they are legally compelled to do when they are telling their own U.S. officials to prepare for something. And it doesn't necessarily mean it has to do with specific threat intelligence, but that because of what the United States did, enter this war that Israel has been waging against Iran and Iran hitting it back, the United States is now a player, not just because we are the biggest provider of arms and weaponry and defenses to Israel, but because now it is our planes that have gone in there and done such a high-profile attack against the crown jewels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.